No, this wreckage isn't some kind of retrospective of all of the damage that SN11 did or how far the debris traveled when it exploded or shortly afterwards. This debris is actually still there, waterlogged and stuck in the mires around Boca Chica, and try as they might, SpaceX still has not been able to remove it. But personally, I think that perhaps it should stay put as sort of a monument or a testament to the difficulty of creating a totally new and innovative system for traveling across the solar system from the ground up. And after all, we have SN15 as a present-day reminder that the process is continuing regardless of what might have happened with SN11, and that excites me tremendously. I mean, it continues to amaze me. This is the vessel that is going to land people on the moon again after more than half a century, complete again with more heat tiles and a bunch of new improvements, a couple hundred of them, although many of them haven't exactly been spelled out yet. But still, I just can't wait for this thing to take off. However, the national ripoff team, Blue Origin, has filed a protest, as many of you probably know, with the GAO, and this is a massive 175-page legal document claiming that NASA did not carry out this contract properly, that they didn't give all of the competitors a proper chance, that they treated SpaceX with favoritism. Honestly, there's no way that I've had time to read all of this, nor am I a lawyer, so I really don't have a good chance of understanding it. But what I can do is review what's been said about it, and thus far, it's possible that Blue Origin may actually have a case, even though their lander, as I've said so many times before, is a piece of garbage. And they're not the only ones, of course, who are filing a protest. Unsurprisingly, on the very same day, Dynetics filed a protest with the GAO as well. They seem to be focused on what they call the acquisition process and also the technical standards, which, if you remember the last video that I did on this subject, I found there to be technical inconsistencies in NASA's conclusion as well. Now, I haven't seen the document. I'm not sure if anybody has. Dynetics has been a lot more closed-mouthed about this whole thing, but nevertheless, just from looking at the comparative technical standards that NASA applied to Dynetics versus everybody else, I can see where they're coming from as well. And yet I am angry that this protest is happening. Very angry, but not for the reasons that you might think. Get ready for a special episode of The Angry Astronaut coming up right now. Good evening, folks, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. Sort of an unexpected episode, one that I was really hoping not to make. In this episode, The Angry Astronaut will be venturing into the unexplored world of the American legal system. So, as many of you have probably heard, both Blue Origin and Dynetics have filed legal protests against NASA's decision on the human landing system. And I want to make one thing abundantly clear right from the beginning. I don't think that this is a good thing. However, I don't think it's a good thing for reasons that might differ from a lot of your own opinions. I don't feel that this is a bunch of spoil sports or anything along those lines because Elon has also sued the US government over decisions made on contracts. Probably the most significant of these is when he received 40% of the military's budget for 5 years worth of military launches. And he felt that SpaceX should get at least equal footing. And he sued over that and he lost. He also said during the process of that ULA was a waste of taxpayers' money. So Elon is no stranger to doing these kinds of things. The reason that I think that it's a bad thing is because regardless of the outcome, NASA is not going to be able to do anything about it. They don't have the funding to have two competitors. They made it abundantly clear, actually, in their report that they wanted at least two competitors heading into the second stage of this process, but they simply couldn't afford it, and SpaceX came out with the best proposal. One of Blue Origin's biggest complaints is the fact that they didn't even get a chance to rebid. Well, NASA made it abundantly clear that they could not rebid in good faith because NASA wouldn't have the money to come anywhere close to the Blue Origin proposal. So regardless of what happens here, all it's going to do is hold Artemis up, especially if the funding is frozen. Because even though Elon is going to spend his own money to develop Starship, Lunar Starship might be a different story. He might not spend as much of his own money on Lunar Starship, and that could hold up Artemis and our return to the moon. And I don't like that one little bit. But nevertheless, I thought that it would probably be a good idea for us to at least look at where Dynetics, not necessarily Blue Origin, I think their lander's a piece of garbage, always have. I think NASA was actually too kind to them in their review, but let's see where they're coming from, what they might be trying to accomplish, and whether or not they might have any points. Even if they do have some points, unless NASA can somehow magically come up with a, $4 or $5 billion or so from Congress, in some sort of emergency appropriation, I don't see how that's going to happen. It's not going to make any difference, and it's not going to have any sort of difference as far as the outcome is concerned. I was expecting this to happen, and I am very sad that it is happening, but it needs to be covered, and that's what we're going to do right now. So yeah, I'm just going to read off a list of these complaints on the Blue Origin argument just while I've got Kerbal Space Program running their lander in the background, because reportedly this whole thing was designed in KSP, although it's notoriously difficult to land the thing because it's so top-heavy, or at least for me, and also people who are very experienced with using this thing, but then again, who knows? I mean, it's KSP, and Blue Origin didn't exactly design this particular version. But the argument is that the agency, as in NASA, improperly failed to amend the solicitation to allow offerers to revise their proposals when the government's requirements changed due to a perception of significantly reduced funding. That actually is true. According to their final selection statement, NASA, quote, considered whether it may be in the government's best interests to engage in price negotiations to seek a lower best and final price from Blue Origin. However, given NASA's current and projected HLS budgets, it is my assessment that such negotiations with Blue Origin, if opened, would not be in good faith. After accounting for a contract award to SpaceX, the amount of remaining available funding is so insubstantial that, in my opinion, NASA cannot reasonably ask Blue Origin to lower its price for the scope of work that it is proposed to a figure that would potentially enable NASA to afford making a contract award to Blue Origin. Therefore, they never made the offer. They never gave Blue Origin an opportunity to renegotiate the way they did with SpaceX. However, this protest fails to mention something very important. Quote, however, the SCP did identify 2 instances of proposed advance payments within Blue Origin's proposal. Proposals containing any advance payments are ineligible for a contract award, unquote. In other words, the richest guy on the planet was demanding advance payments for his lander, even though he could easily afford it without advance payments, and this made him ineligible. And at the end of their comments, as far as that was concerned, quote, I concur with the SCP's assessment that these kickoff meeting related payments are counter to the solicitation's instructions and render Blue Origin's proposal ineligible for award without the government engaging in discussions or negotiations with Blue Origin, either of which would provide an opportunity for it to submit a compliant revised proposal. So regardless of what happened as far as NASA giving Blue Origin another chance, they blew their first chance, at least as far as payments are concerned. Now, okay, I need to be fair here. In Section B of the protest, it does claim that the agency's evaluation erroneously determined that Blue Origin proposed advance payments. Now, how NASA could have misinterpreted that, I have no idea. But in any event, like I say, I'm not a lawyer. All I can do is say that that one factor automatically disqualified Blue Origin, and it pretty much invalidates everything else in here as far as their technical evaluations. The fact that they unreasonably assigned Blue Origin a weakness for its description of transfer element disposal and planetary protection approach, or the agency's evaluation of Blue Origin's guidance, navigation, and control system development risk is unreasonable. It pretty much attacks every claim that was made against Blue Origin. It's a good thing that they didn't talk about the fact that both the transfer element and the lander are not reusable, at least not in the current design, and they also didn't talk about that stinking 10-meter ladder and all of the risks associated with that, along with the fatigue involved with the astronauts. And by the way, for those of you who have argued in the past that things like the transfer element could actually be reused, you need only look at the Blue Origin protest itself. Quote, the transfer element is tracked all the way to lunar impact to ensure successful disposal. The deorbit descent and landing trajectory is designed so transfer element impacts more than 20 kilometers uprange from the landing site. In other words, they get rid of a transfer element every time they land this thing, and the lander too, as far as I can see. There's no way to retrieve the lander once the astronauts have returned on the ascent element. So 2/3 of this lander not being reusable, therefore not very cost effective. I have no idea, therefore, why NASA regarded Dynetics as being more expensive, given that 90% of that lander was reusable. And in case you're in the mood to question the danger of the latter, have a look at what astronauts are going to be wearing on the moon. Watch this poor young lady try to negotiate stairs, and just imagine her trying to negotiate a 10-meter ladder in the same spacesuit. It just defies description how difficult that will be, and yet NASA describes the fatigue that will be involved when they have to leave, and when they arrive there's a process involved with the Blue Origin lander associated with that, but they don't mention anything about how fatiguing and how dangerous it's going to be to ascend and descend 10 meters on a regular basis wearing this thing. And I don't care what you have to say about 1/6 gravity, the bulkiness of this suit is going to make operating out of a Blue Origin lander a harrowing prospect at best. But do they have any other good points? Well, as a matter of fact, yes. One of their points is that at the beginning of this process, NASA did not spell out that price was king, that the price of the bid was going to matter more than anything else, than the technical viability, than the ease of construction. That price would in the end be the primary source of their decision-making process. And that is a good point. It's as if NASA changed course midstream with this contract, which isn't really operating in good faith. I'm not saying that NASA intentionally misled them, but the problem is they didn't get the money they needed, not anywhere close. And they essentially changed the priorities for the bid at the last second, which isn't really fair to the other two competitors. It's also important to note what this contract was all about in the first place, and that was to deliver 2 astronauts to the surface of the moon, astronauts that would be delivered on the Orion space capsule by the SLS to lunar orbit, and then would rendezvous either with the Lunar Gateway or directly with the Human Landing System and land on the moon, and then return those astronauts back to the Orion once. Reusability, although very important to the contract theoretically, really didn't matter because it was only going to be used once. A reusable and sustainable landing system is supposed to come in a future contract, and Blue Origin is making the point, validly I think, that if SpaceX is awarded this contract exclusively, then they're going to have a $3 billion head start on any future contracts to land on the moon, giving them essentially a monopoly on landing on the moon. Like I say, that's kind of a legitimate point, even though there's nothing that can really be done about it. Now, as far as Dynetics is concerned, some of their main problems with this whole thing have been the technical issues. I mean, if you read this NASA report, you'd think that Dynetics was a bunch of kindergartners trying to design this lander, and they just completely blew it. And granted, the thing came in over mass. But here's my question. If it was that bad, then how did it pass preliminary design review back in February, just 2 months ago? I mean, that's a painstaking process. Why would an error that radical just be overlooked and NASA pass them right on through? And as I've said before, NASA completely ignored some of their most important accomplishments, such as the reusability factor. Of course, if we're only doing this once, then reusability doesn't matter, which makes the contract itself pretty BS in my opinion. But in any event, reusability for the Dynetics lander is actually one of its main advantages. To reuse Starship, you have to take it all the way back to LEO so you can completely refuel it, and you can't send a bunch of tankers out to the moon, whereas all you have to do is send a few tons of fuel out to lunar orbit to refuel the Alpaca. And the NASA report makes it very clear that Dynetics has identified this mass issue and is working on fixing it, but they say that they're not confident that they're going to be able to get it done in time. However, they seem to be forgetting the case of Apollo 8, when the LEM was still not ready to go, and there was only a year before man was going to land on the moon. 12 months, and they still didn't have the problems worked out with the LEM. And then, halfway midstream, they decided to put a car on the LEM, which of course added mass, and they managed to do that as well. And one other thing to keep in mind, had Apollo 8 experienced the same problems as Apollo 13, the astronauts would have died, because Jim Lovell and company used the LEM as a lifeboat, and Apollo 8 didn't have a LEM. It would have been an absolute disaster. How times change. There was so much faith in those days with the companies and people involved. Why not the similar faith in Dynetics, who produces lots of extremely important military hardware for the defense of the United States? Need more technical proof? Well, Dynetics, or rather Sierra Nevada Corporation, produced a prototype crew module, complete with all sorts of new technologies and features for astronauts to use and test for journeys to the moon. On top of that, life support prototypes were produced by Paragon Space Development Corporation for the same review, and they were subject to painstaking tests. Neither of the other two competitors have done anything like this, and yet this was not mentioned in the NASA report. And from a logistical standpoint, Dynetics makes a whole lot of sense also. It only takes 3 launches of the Vulcan Centaur or 1 launch of the SLS to deliver this lander. After it's there, it can be used over and over again, and you just have to bring a few tons of fuel and new drop tanks every now and then. Whereas, as I've said before, Blue Origin needs a new transfer element and a new lander every time, and the Starship is going to need an awful lot of fuel, which it's going to have to return to low Earth orbit to get from a fleet of tankers, at least until they build a very large propellant depot in lunar orbit. And finally, both Blue Origin and Dynetics argue that competition is key if something good is going to come out of this. Imagine if with commercial crew, NASA only had about $5 billion to spend, not enough for both of these systems, and they decided to go with this one. Because after all, Boeing had tons of experience in putting humans into space, whereas SpaceX was the new kid on the block. What if they had done that? We never would have gotten to orbit. But in the end, it's not NASA who is to blame, it's these pieces of That felt good, but let's be honest, they decided to underfund this incredibly important program and backed NASA into a corner and forced them to make a decision that they didn't want to make. This would never have happened if they had properly funded HLS, but they didn't, and that's why this is happening right now. It has nothing to do with Dynetics and Blue Origin being a bunch of spoil sports. It has to do with the American government not giving a damn about returning to the moon. As usual, I need to make one thing perfectly clear. I do not believe that NASA made a bad decision here. They made the only decision that they had at their disposal with the funds that they had at their disposal. As a matter of fact, they didn't even have these funds at their disposal. They're still going to have to get requisitions from Congress in order to fund all of this. And I think they realize that as long as Elon, has good faith that they're going to eventually pay off on it, that he'll use his own funds to pay for Lunar Starship until it's complete. As I said before, it was really their only option. And that is what this decision was based on, not really on technical merit, at least as far as Dynetics is concerned. I hope that I've made it really clear in the video as to why Blue Origin simply does not deserve to move on in this process. But given the very small amount of money that Dynetics was given to develop a lander, to develop a complete system from the ground up, I think they accomplished a tremendous amount. Because even though officially SpaceX got less money for Lunar Starship, in reality, does anybody really think that that's all that Elon has spent on Starship? I don't think so. I think that it's more in the billions. So really, Dynetics was outspended by their competitors by a tremendous margin, and yet still came up with some very good results. And if they had been given something close to what they asked for, I think they would have come up with the result as well. But still, SpaceX has a good solution for the problem at a price that NASA can afford. It's a logical decision, but one that neither Dynetics nor Blue Origin are obviously going to take lying down. And I just hope that this process doesn't draw things out too long. I hope that this doesn't delay our return to the moon as this process gets mired in the legal system. That would just be absolutely horrific and just inexcusable. So fingers crossed, we'll see how things develop. But as I have said many times in the past, I am confident that SpaceX will eventually be able to produce a result. I would prefer to see a competition, just like with Commercial Crew. I hope it doesn't come back to bite NASA, but regardless of whether it does or not, they really didn't have a choice, and that is the fault of the American government. That is the fault of Congress and nobody else. So really, this is where the blame lies. Not necessarily with Dynetics, not even kind of with Blue Origin, although really their position is indefensible, as I hope I have proven to you at this point. The problem exists because Congress does not believe enough in Artemis and does not believe enough in our return to the moon, and their attitude needs to change. If you like the way I put things, if you like my commentary, you know how to support me. It's all in the description. And until this process is through, and hopefully it doesn't take terribly long, but with legal matters, you never can tell. But hopefully it's resolved quickly. Hopefully we press forward. And until human beings are once again setting foot on the moon, free of all constraints, and especially free of legal constraints, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.